War sometimes changes. One day you're fighting the soldiers of neighboring countries, the next you find yourself in combat with a wolf the size of a building. That's how things go in the worlds of Fire Emblem, but that doesn't mean it isn't quite a surprise to see these kinds of enemies populate the map. I have no clue honestly how people generally feel about monsters as enemies, so let me know in the comments below. But first, let's take a deep dive into the many bizarre enemies we have faced over the decades. While the original game, Shadow Dragon, barely featured any non-human enemies, only the Earth Dragon Medusa as final boss, the second title, Gaiden, or Shadows of Valentia as I'm sure most of us have played it, is a monster mash. While the remake switches the name to Terrors, the original game called them Monsters, and I honestly think that's a better title. It suits what we face here. Because it truly is a bizarre amalgamation of weird creatures summoned through the powers of Duma. There are several different kind of zombie or skeleton-esque enemies here that I will tackle later in the video, but there's still a ton to cover here. For example, the perfect monster to face when sieging a castle, the gargoyle. Unlike most gargoyles I know, these don't have arms, meaning they use their feet to hold and attack with their scythes, which is honestly really impressive, great dexterity on their part. While their appearance is quite unusual for Fire Emblem standards, functionally they are pretty similar to Pegasus or Wyvern Knights, like we've seen in plenty of other games, including their weakness to archers and wind magic. Two stronger versions also make an appearance, the blue Death Coil and the red Garuda, but those are basically just promoted versions of the regular gargoyle. They're only different in minor ways, like a new color scheme and enough bravery to take a nose piercing. Another terror that basically functions the same as the pre-existing enemy class for humans is the Fiend, which is by all accounts a Baron, except now terrifying. In fact, in Gaiden, these enemies literally are Barons, with Fiends being a new distinction made for Echoes. What is important to note about these though is that they are Great Terrors, which is a new category in the remake that protects enemies of this type against moves like Expel, which snaps terrors out of existence like it's nothing. Just like the gargoyles, these all come in a stronger variant, being the Guardian, which is a fiend with red paint tacked on and 1 movement more. An exceptionally rare enemy from Echoes is the Vestal, which only appears in Act 6 with a low spawn chance to boot, meaning you can easily play the entire game and never encounter it. It's easier to find as a reinforcement for Grima in Tabe's Labyrinth, but similarly I'm not sure how many players have ever seen that. Then again, Vestals are mostly just a regular enemy version of what Renea ends up becoming, being this spirit engulfed in flames, except with a different hairstyle. Both can summon witches using Conjure, which really just makes Renea a Vestal in almost everything except name, as her class technically is a witch. Arguably the most bizarre enemy of this game are the Moguls, which are these flying eyeball creatures. Well, at first sight that may not be such a worrying thought. Let me tell you, these guys are not to be underestimated. They're not the strongest enemy in the game, but they are easily the most annoying, seeing as they can split themselves up and create new Moguls out of thin air. And that means that if you're not quick to engage, 1 Mogul becomes 2, 2 become 4, 4 become 8, etc. Both Duma and Jedha love spawning these on repeat, and have I mentioned these guys are Great Terrors for some reason, meaning you can't expel them? Trust me, you'll be looking them in the eye a lot more than you've ever wanted. Following Gaiden, monsters would vanish from the series almost entirely, with the Jugdrawl games featuring none really, and after series director Sho Zukaga left Intelligent Systems, it seemed like he had taken the monsters with him to his new venture, Tear Ring Saga. But after 2 GBA games that indeed barely featured any, Sacred Stones brought them back in grand fashion. It's implied the monsters in Magvel are more of a natural thing to the world than the terrors were though, seeing as everyone just seems to accept they exist as long as they stay in the Darkling Woods, which they can't leave thanks to the Sacred Stones. But when those end up destroyed, the continent becomes swarmed with these things. And who was there leading the line? The Moguls, once again. Seems like Fomortis and Duma are drawing from the same source. In this game though, they're a lot weaker, not even remotely as strong as in Gaiden. And most importantly, they don't duplicate. And while they were, in my opinion, Valentia's weirdest enemy, they're not even top 3 in Sacred Stones. One of those spots is definitely claimed by the Gorgon, I would say, a snake-human hybrid that hatches from eggs, as seen in chapter 18. They are not just remarkably strong, but also capable of turning your units to stone, which is essentially a stronger version of sleep. This move is obviously a reference to Medusa, who may not be a human-snake hybrid in the same way as the Gorgons, but it's close enough. Other enemies inspired by Greek mythology include the Cyclops, the famed humanoid monster with one eye, which has an interestingly high S rank in Axis, and the Tarvos, as well as their promoted version Meldwin. These two are based on centaurs, having the lower body of a bull and the upper body of a man. They're basically mounted units, meaning they're also weak to the Horse Slayer, for example. A half-Greek reference is the duo of Mavduk and Gwilgi, these large dog or hound-like enemies, of which the latter promoted version has 3 heads and is based on Cerberus, the multi-headed dog that guards the gates of the underworld in Greek mythology. The regular Mavduk is just a larger Marmaduke, albeit one with fiery fangs apparently, as that's what their attack is called. This duo is characterized by their large movement and high speed, but their defenses and HP are quite weak. And while we're on supersized animals, we have to tackle arguably the most infamous monster of the series, or sacred stones at the very least, being the Baal. Enormous spiders that apparently mostly live in the mountains, best known for their appearance in Chapter 9, Victims of War, where you have to save literal children from being devoured. And considering that's pretty difficult, there's a relatively big chance you'll fail and have their blood on your hands, only for that to then be immortalized as a trading card in Fire Emblem Cypher. Pretty messed up stuff. And let me just say, as the self-appointed president of the Arachnophobia Club, these babies are the reason I'm not too eager to get a Sacred Stones remake. Just like Gaiden, Sacred Stones also has a wide variety of enemies that we could probably consider to be undead, but unlike random gargoyles and centaurs, enemies of this kind are actually quite common. In fact, I would say the whole zombie enemy thing is probably the most undiscussed trope in Fire Emblem ever. I rarely hear people talk about this, but at this point, like half the series turns into The Walking Dead every few chapters. From the games we have already covered, you have the Bone Walkers, Wights, Titans, Lich, Deimos, Tomb Lords, Dracules, Revenants, and the Entombed. Those last two also appear in Awakening, alongside the Risen, probably the most famous zombie-like enemies in Fire Emblem. They serve as the army of Grima and are indeed undead humans, although some sentience still remains, especially in the Risen Chiefs, who even have some dialogue. The lore behind the Risen is quite interesting and well hidden too, found within Shadows of Valentia actually, not Awakening. It explains how an alchemist from Talbas in Arcania, Forneus, created not only the Risen but also Grima himself, all based on the image of his deceased wife. Similar enemies would appear in Fates, known as the Faceless. These already feel a lot more human-like, even if they're not sentient. That's the entire point, and what makes them of use to Nor. But they're definitely a minor factor in the story of Fates, to the point you're left wondering why they're even here in the first place. That same thing cannot be said about the Corrupted from Engage. They're very prevalent enemies from the start to the end. These are quite similar to the Faceless, right down to the point of very important characters appearing in their undead forms. What I really dislike about the Corrupted though, is that there seem to be different rules for different resurrected people for no reason whatsoever. Why do all corrupted soldiers look generic and unrecognizable, but say Lumera and Morion like themselves but twisted? I know the answer, it's because it's cool and supposed to be a gut punch, but that's not an excuse. Other enemies that kinda fit this category but are not exactly the same are the Necro Dragons or Zombie Dragons from Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia, which are undead dragons obviously instead of humans, the Corrupted Wolves from Engage, which feel quite random if you ask me, and the Dead Lords from Genealogy of the Holy War and later Thracia and Awakening as well. Details on these vary per game, but they are the resurrected corpses of actual characters instead of generic enemies, which is a way better use of the trope in my opinion. Something similar happens in the Blazing Blade with the Morphs, which are not undead, I guess. It's said Nergal creates them from recycled quintessence, but the outcome is pretty similar. They can be incredibly sentient though, all depending on how they were crafted, with Limstella and Sonya as highly capable examples. On the other end of the spectrum there is Denning, who seems to be created with the sole purpose of being a PA system. The only game released in the last decade to not feature any zombie-like enemies is, as such, Free Houses, but that doesn't mean it's without its bizarre foes. The vast majority of weird enemies are caused by Crest Stones, who can have some wildly different effects depending on who they're given to. In the right hands, they're very powerful relics, but in the wrong hands, they turn the holder into a demonic beast, which come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Most common are the dragon-like beasts, with the biggest difference coming in how they were created. Little sidestep here, but I'm not too proud to admit I thought for the longest time that the EXP demonic beast, as it's called at Free Houses and Hopes for spatial reasons, actually was, well, that. A demonic beast that gave a ton of EXP. But no, the EXP is short for experimental, in the sense that the sliverers are just trying it out to see what happens. Other beings that can become warped by Creststone are wolves, birds and worms, turning into gigantic versions of themselves. I've always wondered though, how can a worm hold a Creststone that's much larger than itself? Even with help, how is that supposed to work? The Garfin secret, I suppose. Just like how exactly they created the Titaness, a rare boss that's essentially a giant robot knight, not too dissimilar to the golems, similar big mechanical constructs created by the Nabateans and the Church of Saros instead, with the purpose of guarding their sacred locations. They come in two variants, the regular golem with a design similar to a statue, and the altered golem, which resembles a knight in golden armor. Quite similar to this concept are the Stoneborn from Fates. These are also artificial constructs, but given life by Nor instead. And they truly appear to have been given life, as they are shown to be sentient. Design-wise, they may just be the weirdest enemy of this entire video, with a body like a human, but a bizarre mask of a face that resembles the real-life artwork of Bocca della Verità, which is Italian for Mouth of Truth. It's said this marble face will bite off the hand of any liar that puts their hand in his mouth. So I suggest we try it out with the leaker who said a genealogy of the Holy War remake is coming and see what happens. While dragons are at this point barely a bizarre enemy anymore, they don't really qualify in my opinion at least, I do want to take a brief moment to highlight the extreme disbalance between Shadow Dragon and its sequel Mystery of the Emblem when it comes to this. Like I mentioned before, Shadow Dragon has one dragon in its entire game, but in Mystery of the Emblem the number is expanded by what feels like 100-fold. Fire dragons, ice dragons, earth dragons, wyverns. There are entire chapters in the second half of the game where every enemy is a dragon. Again, it's not really that bizarre anymore at this point in the franchise, but I can imagine that at the time, fans may have been quite surprised at that. And finally, I want to look at what is possibly the most bizarre enemy of them all. And it isn't even a monster. It's not a zombie, it's bizarre in how incredibly unnecessary it is. Meet the Corsair, an enemy class that appears only in the Blazing Blade and only in the chapter 4 Fanged Offensive and only in the Linus version. Talk about being obscure. Functionally, this enemy class is the exact same as a pirate. They use the same weapons, have the same stats, same abilities, etc. And if you play the English version of the game, your questions as to why this class even exists will never be answered. But in Japanese, they just reveal it in the enemy description. Pirates rule the seas, Corsairs rule lakes. That's it. Since the map is set next to a lake instead of the open sea, they are at least appropriately placed. But man, would there have been anyone out there who had complained if these enemies had just been pirates? I don't think so. But, you know, let's give this the applause it deserves. It's true dedication to not only aesthetics, but also the rules and definitions that have been set for the world. And now I'm just left wondering where all that went when Morion became a corrupted. But hey, you've heard enough out of me for today. What are your experiences with these bizarre enemies and what are your thoughts on these tropes? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.